stock, even though the stock was non-controlling. Buffett assured her that Berkshire's purchase was for investment purposes only. To further reassure her, he offered to give her son Don, slated to take over the company someday, a proxy to vote Berkshire's shares. That clinched it. Katharine Graham responded by inviting Buffett to join the board of directors in 1974 and soon made him chairman of the finance committee. Katharine Graham died in July 2001, after a fall in which she sustained severe head injuries. Warren Buffett was one of the ushers at her funeral services at Washington's National Cathedral. Donald E. Graham, son of Phil and Katharine, is chairman of the board of the Washington Post Company. Don Graham graduated magna cum laude from Harvard in 1966, having majored in English, history and literature. After graduation, he served 2 years in the Army. Knowing that he would eventually lead the Washington Post, Graham decided to get better acquainted with the city. He took the unusual path of joining the Metropolitan Police Force of Washington, D.C., and spent 14 months as a patrolman walking the beat in the 9th Precinct. In 1971, Graham went to work at the Washington Post as a Metro reporter. Later, he spent 10 months as a reporter for Newsweek at the Los Angeles bureau. Graham returned to the Post in 1974 and became the assistant managing sports editor. That year, he was added to the company's board of directors. Buffett's role at the Washington Post is widely documented. He helped Katharine Graham persevere during the labor strikes of the 1970s, and he also tutored Don Graham in business, helping him understand the role of management and its responsibility to its owners. In finance, Don Graham says, "He's the smartest guy I know. I don't know who is second." 15 Looking at the story from the reverse side, it's also clear that the Post has played a major role for Buffett as well. Finance journalist Andrew Kilpatrick, who has followed Buffett's career for years, believes that the Washington Post Company investment locked up Buffett's reputation as a master investor. 16 Berkshire has not sold any of its Washington Post stock since the original purchase in 1973. In 2004, the Class B stock was selling for more than $900 a share, making it the second most expensive stock on the New York Stock Exchange. Berkshire's holdings are now worth more than $1 billion, and Buffett's original investment has increased in value more than 50-fold. 17 Wells Fargo and Company In October 1990, Berkshire Hathaway announced it had purchased 5 million shares of Wells Fargo and Company at an average price of $57.88 per share, a total investment of $289 million. With this purchase, Berkshire became the largest shareholder of the bank, owning 10% of the shares outstanding. It was a controversial move. Earlier in the year, the share price traded as high as $86. Then dropped sharply as investors abandoned California banks in droves. At the time, the West Coast was in the throes of a severe recession and some speculated that banks, with their loan portfolios stocked full of commercial and residential mortgages, were in trouble. Wells Fargo, with the most commercial real estate of any California bank, was thought to be particularly vulnerable. In the months following Berkshire's announcement, the battle for Wells Fargo resembled a heavyweight fight. Buffett, in one corner, was the bull, betting $289 million that Wells Fargo would increase in value. In the other corner, short sellers were the bears, betting that Wells Fargo, already down 49% for the year, was destined to fall further. The rest of the investment world decided to sit back and watch. Twice in 1992, Berkshire acquired more shares, bringing the total to 63 million by year-end. The price crept over $100 per share, but short sellers were still betting the stock would lose half its value. Buffett has continued to add to his position, and by year-end 2003, Berkshire owned more than 56 million shares, with a market value of $4.6 billion and a total accumulated purchase cost of $2.8 billion. In 2003, Moody's gave Wells Fargo a AAA credit rating, the only bank in the country with that distinction. The intelligent investor. The most distinguishing trait of Buffett's investment philosophy is the clear understanding that by owning shares of stocks he owns businesses, not pieces of paper. The idea of buying stocks without understanding the company's operating functions, its products and services, labor relations, raw material expenses, plant and equipment, capital reinvestment requirements, inventories, receivables, and needs for working capital, is unconscionable, says Buffett. This mentality reflects the attitude of a business owner as opposed to a stock owner, and is the only mentality an investor should have. In the Summation of the Intelligent Investor, Benjamin Graham wrote, "Investing is most intelligent when it is most businesslike." Those are, says Buffett, the 9 most important words ever written about investing. A person who holds stocks has the choice to become the owner of a business or the bearer of tradable securities. Owners of common stocks who perceive that they merely own a piece of paper are far removed from the company's financial statements. They behave as if the market's ever-changing price is a more accurate reflection of their stock's value than the business's balance sheet and income statement. They draw or discard stocks like playing cards. For Buffett, the activities of a common stockholder and a business owner are intimately connected. Both should look at ownership of a business in the same way. "I am a better investor because I am a businessman," Buffett says, "and a better businessman because I am an investor." 5. Investing Guidelines, Business Tenets. We come now to the heart of the matter, the essence of Warren Buffett's way of thinking about investing. Warren Buffett is so thoroughly identified with the stock market that even people who have no interest in the market know his name and reputation. Others, those who read the financial pages of the newspaper only casually, may know him as the head of an unusual company whose stock sells for upward of $90,000 per share. And even the many new investors who enthusiastically devote careful attention to market news think of him primarily as a brilliant stock picker. Few would deny that the world's most famous and most successful investor is indeed a brilliant stock picker. But that seriously understates the case. His real gift is picking companies. I mean this in 2 senses. First, Berkshire Hathaway, in addition to its famous stock portfolio, owns many companies directly. Second, when considering new stock purchases, Buffett looks at the underlying business as thoroughly as he would if he were buying the whole company, using a set of basic principles developed over many years. When investing, he says, we view ourselves as business analysts, not as market analysts, not as macroeconomic analysts, and not even as security analysts. If we go back through time and review all of Buffett's purchases, looking for the commonalities, we find a set of basic principles, or tenets, that have guided his decisions. If we extract these tenets and spread them out for a closer look, we see that they naturally group themselves into 4 categories. 1. Business tenets. 3 basic characteristics of the business itself. 2. Management tenets. 3 important qualities that senior managers must display. 3. Financial tenets. 4 critical financial decisions that the company must maintain. 4. Value tenets. 2 interrelated guidelines about purchase price. Not all of Buffett's acquisitions will display all the tenets, but taken as a group, these tenets constitute the core of his investment approach. They can also serve as guideposts for all investors. In this chapter, we look at the first group, the characteristics of the business, and study how some of Buffett's investment decisions reflect those tenets. For Buffett, stocks are an abstraction. 3 He does not think in terms of market theories, macroeconomic concepts, or sector trends. Rather, he makes investment decisions based only on how a business operates. He believes that if people choose an investment for superficial reasons instead of business fundamentals, they are more likely to be scared away at the first sign of trouble, in all likelihood losing money in the process. Buffett concentrates on learning all he can about the business under consideration, focusing on 3 main areas. 1. Is the business simple and understandable? 2. Does the business have a consistent operating history? 3. Does the business have favorable long-term prospects? A simple and understandable business in Buffett's view. Investors' financial success is correlated to the degree in which they understand their investment. This understanding is a distinguishing trait that separates investors with a business orientation from most hit-and-run investors, people who merely buy shares of stock. It is critical to the buy or don't buy decision for this reason. In the final analysis, after all their research, investors must feel convinced that the business they are buying into will perform well over time. They must have some confidence in their estimate of its future earnings, and that has a great deal to do with how well they understand its business fundamentals. Predicting the future is always tricky. It becomes enormously more difficult in an arena you know nothing about. Over the years, Buffett has owned a vast array of businesses: a gas station, a farm implementation business, textile companies, a major retailer, banks, insurance companies, advertising agencies, aluminum and cement companies, newspapers, oil, mineral, and mining companies, food, beverage, and tobacco companies, television and cable companies. Some of these companies he controlled, and in others he was or is a minority shareholder. But in all cases, he was or is acutely aware of how these businesses operate. He understands the revenues, expenses, cash flow, labor relations, pricing flexibility, and capital allocation needs of every single one of Berkshire's holdings. Buffett is able to maintain a high level of knowledge about Berkshire's businesses because he purposely limits his selections to companies that are within his area of financial and intellectual understanding. He calls it his circle of competence. His logic is compelling. If you own a company, either fully or some of its shares, in an industry you do not understand, it is impossible to accurately interpret developments and therefore impossible to make wise decisions. Invest within your circle of competence, he counsels. It's not how big the circle is that counts, it's how well you define the parameters. 4 critics have argued that Buffett's self-imposed restrictions exclude him from industries that offer the greatest investment potential, such as technology. His response: investment success is not a matter of how much you know but how realistically you define what you don't know. An investor needs to do very few things right as long as he or she avoids big mistakes. 5 Producing above-average results, Buffett has learned, often comes from doing ordinary things. The key is to do those things exceptionally well. Coca-Cola Company. The business of Coca-Cola is relatively simple. The company purchases commodity inputs and combines them to manufacture a concentrate that is sold to bottlers. The bottlers then combine the concentrate with other ingredients and sell the finished product to retail outlets including minimarts, supermarkets, and vending machines. The company also provides soft drink syrups to fountain retailers, who sell soft drinks to consumers in cups and glasses. The company's name brand products include Coca-Cola, Diet Coke, Sprite, Pi BB Extra, Mellow Yellow, Fanta soft drinks, Tab, Dasani, and Frisca. The company's beverages also include Hi-C brand fruit drinks, Minute Maid orange juice, Powerade, and Nestea. The company owns 45% of Coca-Cola Enterprises, the largest bottler in the United States, and 35% of Coca-Cola Amatil, an Australian bottler that has interests not only in Australia but also in New Zealand and Eastern Europe. The strength of Coca-Cola is not only its name brand products but also its unmatched worldwide distribution system. Today, international sales of Coca-Cola products account for 69% of the company's net sales and 80% of its profits. In addition to Coca-Cola Amatil, the company has equity interests in bottlers located in Mexico, South America, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China. The Washington Post company Buffett's grandfather once owned and edited the Cumming County Democrat, a weekly newspaper in West Point, Nebraska. His grandmother helped out at the paper and also set the type at the family's printing shop. His father, while attending the University of Nebraska, edited the Daily Nebraskan, Buffett himself was once the circulation manager for the Lincoln Journal. It has often been said that if Buffett had not embarked on a business career, he most surely would have pursued journalism. In 1969, Buffett bought his first major newspaper, the Omaha Sun, along with a group of weekly papers. From them he learned the business dynamics of a newspaper. He had 4 years of hands-on experience running a newspaper before he bought his first share of the Washington Post. Wells Fargo. Buffett understands the banking business very well. In 1969, Berkshire bought 98% of the Illinois National Bank and Trust Company and held it until 1979, when the Bank Holding Act required Berkshire to divest its interest. During that 10-year period, the bank took its place beside Berkshire's other controlled holdings, and Buffett reported its sales and earnings each year in Berkshire's annual reports. Just as Jack Ringwalt helped Buffett understand the intricacy of the insurance business, see Chapter 3, Gina Begg, who was chairman of Illinois National Bank, taught Buffett about the banking business. He learned that banks are profitable businesses as long as loans are issued responsibly and costs are curtailed. A well-managed bank could not only grow its earnings but also earn a handsome return on equity. The key is well managed. The long-term value of a bank, as Buffett learned, is determined by the actions of its managers, because they control the two critical variables, costs and loans. Bad managers have a way of running up the costs of operations while making foolish loans. Good managers are always looking for ways to cut costs and rarely make risky loans. Carl Reichardt, then chairman of Wells Fargo, had run the bank since 1983, with impressive results. Under his leadership, growth in earnings and return on equity were both above average and operating efficiencies were among the highest in the country. Reichardt had also built a solid loan portfolio. Consistency. Warren Buffett cares very little for stocks that are hot at any given moment. He is far more interested in buying into companies that he believes will be successful and profitable for the long term. And while predicting future success is certainly not foolproof, a steady track record is a relatively reliable indicator. When a company has demonstrated consistent results with the same type of products year after year, it is not unreasonable to assume that those results will continue. As long, that is, as nothing major changes. Buffett avoids purchasing companies that are fundamentally changing direction because their previous plans were unsuccessful. It has been his experience that undergoing major business changes increases the likelihood of committing major business errors. Severe change and exceptional returns usually don't mix, Buffett observes. 6 Most individuals, unfortunately, invest as if the opposite were true. Too often, they scramble to purchase stocks of companies that are in the midst of a corporate reorganization. For some unexplained reason, says Buffett, these investors are so infatuated with the notion of what tomorrow may bring that they ignore today's business reality. In contrast, Buffett says, his approach is very much profiting from lack of change. That's the kind of business I like. 7 Buffett also tends to avoid businesses that are solving difficult problems. Experience has taught him that turnarounds seldom turn. It can be more profitable to expend energy purchasing good businesses at reasonable prices than difficult businesses at cheaper prices. Charlie and I have not learned how to solve difficult business problems, Buffett admits. What we have learned is to avoid them. To the extent that we have been successful, it is because we concentrated on identifying 1-foot hurdles that we could step over rather than because we acquired any ability to clear 7-footers. 8 The Coca-Cola Company. No other company today can match Coca-Cola's consistent operating history. This is a business that was started in the 1880s selling a beverage product. Today, 120 years later, Coca-Cola is selling the same beverage. Even though the company has periodically invested in unrelated businesses, its core beverage business has remained largely unchanged. The only significant difference today is the company's size and its geographic reach. 100 years ago, the company employed 10 traveling salesmen to cover the entire United States. At that point, The company was selling 116,492 gallons of syrup a year, for annual sales of $148,000.90. 50 years later, in 1938, the company was selling 207 million cases of soft drinks annually, having converted sales from gallons to cases. That year, an article in Fortune noted, it would be hard to name any company comparable to Coca-Cola and selling, as Coca-Cola does, an unchanged product that can point to a 10-year record anything like Coca-Cola's. 10 today, nearly 70 years after that article was published, Coca-Cola is still selling syrup. The only difference is the increase in quantity. By the year 2003, the company was selling over 19 billion cases of soft drink in more than 200 countries, generating $22 billion a year in sales. The Washington Post company Buffett tells Berkshire's shareholders that his first financial connection with the Washington Post was at age 13. He delivered both the Washington Post and the Times-Herald on his paper route while his father served in Congress. Buffett likes to remind others that with this dual delivery route he merged the two papers long before Phil Gramm bought the Times-Herald. Obviously, Buffett was aware of the newspaper's rich history. And he considered Newsweek magazine a predictable business. He quickly learned the value of the company's television stations. The Washington Post had been reporting for years the stellar performance of its broadcast division. Buffett's personal experience with the company and its own successful history led him to believe that the Washington Post was a consistent and dependable business performer. Gillette. Few companies have dominated their industry as long as Gillette. It was the lead brand of razors and blades in 1923 and the lead brand in 2003. Maintaining that position for so many years has required the company to spend hundreds of millions of dollars inventing new, improved products. Even though Wilkinson, in 1962, developed the first coated stainless steel blade, Gillette bounced back quickly and has since worked hard to remain the world's leading innovator of shaving products. In 1972, Gillette developed the popular twin-blade Track 2, in 1977, the Atra razor with its pivoting head. Then, in 1989, the company developed the popular Sensor, a razor with independently suspended blades. Gillette's consistent success is a result of its innovation and patent protection of its new products. Clayton Homes. In fiscal year 2002, Clayton reported its 28th consecutive year of profits, $126 million, up 16% from the year before, on revenue of $1.20 billion. 11 This performance is all the more extraordinary when we consider the fearsome problems that others in the industry experienced. In the late 1990s, over 80 factories and 4,000 retailers went out of business, a victim of two colliding forces. Many manufacturers had expanded too quickly and at the same time had made too many weak loans, which inevitably led to widespread repossessions, followed by diminished demand for new housing. Clayton had a different way of doing business. More about their policies in Chapter 6. Its sound management and skillful handling of rough times enabled the company to maintain profitability even as competitors were going bankrupt. Favorable long-term prospects. We like stocks that generate high returns on invested capital, Buffett told those in attendance at Berkshire's 1995 annual meeting, where there is a strong likelihood that it will continue to do so. 12 I look at long-term competitive advantage, he later added, and whether that's something that's enduring. 13 That means he looks for what he terms franchises. According to Buffett, the economic world is divided into a small group of franchises and a much larger group of commodity businesses, most of which are not worth purchasing. He defines a franchise as a company whose product or service, 1, is needed or desired, 2, has no close substitute, and 3, is not regulated. Individually and collectively, these create what Buffett calls a moat, something that gives the company a clear advantage over others and protects it against incursions from the competition. The bigger the moat, the more sustainable, the better he likes it. The key to investing, he says, is determining the competitive advantage of any given company and, above all, the durability of that advantage. The products or services that have wide, sustainable moats around them are the ones that deliver rewards to investors. 14. To see what a moat looks like, read the story of Larsen Juhl in Chapter 8. A franchise that is the only source of a product people want can regularly increase prices without fear of losing market share or unit volume. Often a franchise can raise its prices even when demand is flat and capacity is not fully utilized. This pricing flexibility is one of the defining characteristics of a franchise. It allows franchises to earn above-average returns on invested capital. Another defining characteristic is that franchises possess a greater amount of economic goodwill, which enables them to better withstand the effects of inflation. Another is the ability to survive economic mishaps and still endure. In Buffett's succinct phrase, the definition of a great company is one that will be great for 25 to 30 years. 16. Conversely, a commodity business offers a product that is virtually indistinguishable from the products of its competitors. Years ago, basic commodities included oil, gas, chemicals, wheat, copper, lumber, and orange juice. Today, computers, automobiles, airline service, banking, and insurance have become commodity-type products. Despite mammoth advertising budgets, they are unable to achieve meaningful product differentiation. Commodity businesses, generally, are low-returning businesses and prime candidates for profit trouble. 17. Since their product is basically no different from anyone else's, they can compete only on the basis of price, which severely undercuts profit margins. The most dependable way to make a commodity business profitable, then, is to be the low-cost provider. The only other time commodity businesses turn a profit is during periods of tight supply, a factor that can be extremely difficult to predict. In fact, a key to determining the long-term profitability of a commodity business, Buffett notes, is the ratio of supply tight to supply ample years. This ratio, however, is often fractional. The most recent supply-tight period in Berkshire's textile division, Buffett quips, lasted the better part of a morning. The Coca-Cola Company. Shortly after Berkshire's 1989 public announcement that it owned 6.3% of the Coca-Cola Company, Buffett was interviewed by Melissa Turner, a business writer for the Atlanta Constitution. She asked Buffett a question he has been asked often: why hadn't he purchased shares in the company sooner? By way of answer, Buffett related what he was thinking at the time he finally made the decision. Let's say you were going away for 10 years, he explained, and you wanted to make one investment and you know everything that you know now, and you couldn't change it while you're gone. What would you think about? Of course, the business would have to be simple and understandable. Of course, the company would have to have demonstrated a great deal of business consistency over the years. And of course, the long-term prospects would have to be favorable. If I came up with anything in terms of certainty, where I knew the market was going to continue to grow, where I knew the leader was going to continue to be the leader, I mean worldwide, and where I knew there would be big unit growth, I just don't know anything like Coke. I'd be relatively sure that when I came back they would be doing a hell of a lot more business than they do now. 22. But why purchase at that particular time? Coca-Cola's business attributes, as described by Buffett, have existed for several decades. What caught his eye, he confesses, were the changes occurring at Coca-Cola during the 1980s, under the leadership of Roberto Goizueta. Goizueta, raised in Cuba, was Coca-Cola's first foreign chief executive officer. In 1980, Robert Woodruff, the company's 91-year-old patriarch, brought him in to correct the problems that had plagued the company during the 1970s. It was a dismal period for Coca-Cola: disputes with bottlers, accusations of mistreatment of migrant workers at the company's Minute Maid groves. Environmentalists claimed that Coke's one-way containers contributed to the country's growing pollution problem, and the Federal Trade Commission charged that the company's exclusive franchise system violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Coca-Cola's international business was reeling as well. One of Goizueta's first hacks was to bring together Coca-Cola's top 50 managers for a meeting in Palm Springs, California. "Tell me what we're doing wrong," he said. "I want to know it all, and once it's settled, I want 100% loyalty. If anyone is not happy, we will make you a good settlement and say goodbye." 23 Goizueta encouraged his managers to take intelligent risks. He wanted Coca-Cola to initiate action rather than to be reactive. He began cutting costs. And he demanded that any business that Coca-Cola owned must optimize its return on assets. These actions immediately translated into increasing profit margins and captured the attention of Warren Buffett. The Washington Post company, the economics of a dominant newspaper, Buffett once wrote, "are excellent, among the very best in the world." 24 The vast majority of U.S. newspapers operate without any direct competition. The owners of those newspapers like to believe that the exceptional profits they earn each year are a result of their paper's journalistic quality. "The truth," said Buffett, "is that even a third-rate newspaper can generate adequate professorates if it is the only paper in town. That makes it a classic franchise, with all the benefits thereof. It is true that a high-quality paper will achieve a greater penetration rate, but even a mediocre paper," he explains, "is essential to a community for its bulletin board appeal. Every business in town, every home seller, every individual who wants to get a message out to the community needs the circulation of a newspaper to do so. The paper's owner receives, in effect, a royalty on every business in town that wants to advertise. In addition to their franchise quality, newspapers possess valuable economic goodwill. As Buffett points out, newspapers have low capital needs, so they can easily translate sales into profits. Even expensive computer-assisted printing presses and newsroom electronic systems are quickly paid for by lower fixed-wage costs. Newspapers also are able to increase prices relatively easily, thereby generating above-average returns on invested capital and reducing the harmful effects of inflation. Buffett figures that a typical newspaper could double its price and still retain 90% of its readership. The McLane Company. McLane is perched on the edge of great growth potential. Now that it is no longer part of Walmart, it is free to pursue arrangements with Walmart's competitors, such as Target and other large stores in the United States. This, combined with the company's focus on efficiency and investment in enterprise-wide software systems, freight management, and point-of-sale systems among other automated processes, will enable McLane to maintain price efficiency and service quality. At the time Buffett bought McLane, some of the industry players, such as Fleming and U.S. Food Service, a division of Royal Ahold, were going through difficult times for various reasons. Although it is doubtful that this influenced Buffett's decision, it was said at the time that if Fleming did indeed go under, an extra $7 billion worth of bussiness would be up for grabs. The Pampered Chef has demonstrated a consistency that many older businesses might well envy, with a growth rate of 22% each year from 1995 to 2001. And the long-term outlook is strong. According to the Direct Selling Association, party plan businesses raked in more than $7 billion nationwide in 2000, an increase of $2.7 billion since 1996. Christopher herself is not slowing down. She believes that American cupboards have plenty of room for more products and points out that Mary Kay, a direct-sell cosmetics company, has a sales force of 600,000, giving her plenty of room to grow. Christopher is developing new products, such as ceramic servingware, and is expanding into Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Finally, the company is structured in such a way that it does not need a lot of capital to expand and it has no sizable competition in its category. 6. Investing Guidelines, Management Tenets. When considering a new investment or a business acquisition, Buffett looks very hard at the quality of management. He tells us that the companies or stocks Berkshire purchases must be operated by honest and competent managers whom he can admire and trust. We do not wish to join with managers who lack admirable qualities, he says, no matter how attractive the prospects of their business. We've never succeeded in making a good deal with a bad person. When he finds managers he admires, Buffett is generous with his praise. Year after year, readers of the chairman's letter in Berkshire's annual reports find Buffett's warm words about those who manage the various Berkshire companies. He is just as thorough when it comes to the management of companies whose stock he has under consideration. In particular, he looks for 3 traits. 1. Is management rational? 2. Is management candid with the shareholders? 3. Does management resist the institutional imperative? The highest compliment Buffett can pay a manager is that he or she unfailingly behaves and thinks like an owner of the company. Managers who behave like owners tend not to lose sight of the company's prime objective, increasing shareholder value, and they tend to make rational decisions that further that goal. Buffett also greatly admires managers who take seriously their responsibility to report fully and genuinely to shareholders and who have the courage to resist what he has termed the institutional imperative, blindly following industry peers. All this has taken on a new level of urgency, as shocking discoveries of corporate wrongdoings have come to light. Buffett has always insisted on doing business only with people of the highest integrity. Sometimes that stance has put him at odds with other well-known names in the corporate world. It has not always been fashionable in business circles to speak of integrity, honesty, and trustworthiness as qualities to be admired. In fact, at times such talk might have been disparaged as naive and out of touch with business reality. It is a particularly sweet bit of poetic justice that Buffett's stand on corporate integrity now seems to be a brilliant strategy. But his motivation is not strategic, it comes from his own unshakable value system. And no one has ever seriously accused Warren Buffett of being naive. Later in this chapter, we look more deeply into Buffett's responses to these issues of ethical corporate behavior, particularly excessive executive compensation, stock options, director independence and accountability, and accounting trickery. He tells us what he thinks must be changed to protect shareholder interests and gives us ideas on how investors can evaluate managers to determine whether they are trustworthy. Rationality. The most important management act, Buffett believes, is allocation of the company's capital. It is the most important because allocation of capital, over time, determines shareholder value. Deciding what to do with the company's earnings, reinvest in the business, or return money to shareholders, is, in Buffett's mind, an exercise in logic and rationality. Rationality is the quality that Buffett thinks distinguishes his style with which he runs Berkshire, and the quality he often finds lacking in other corporations, writes Carol Loomis of Fortune. 6 The issue usually becomes important when a company reaches a certain level of maturity, where its growth rate slows and it begins to generate more cash than it needs for development and operating costs. At that point, the question arises, how should those earnings be allocated? If the extra cash, reinvested internally, can produce an above-average return on equity, a return that is higher than the cost of capital, then the company should retain all its earnings and reinvest them. That is the only logical course. Retaining earnings to reinvest in the company at less than the average cost of capital is completely irrational. It is also quite common. A company that provides average or below average investment returns but generates cash in excess of its needs has 3 options. 1. It can ignore the problem and continue to reinvest at below average rates. 2. It can buy growth, or 3. It can return the money to shareholders. It is at this crossroad that Buffett keenly focuses on management. It is here that managers will behave rationally or irrationally. Generally, managers who continue to reinvest despite below-average returns do so in the belief that the situation is temporary. They are convinced that, with managerial prowess, they can improve their company's profitability. Shareholders become mesmerized with management's forecast of improvements. If a company continually ignores this problem, cash will become an increasingly idle resource and the stock price will decline. A company with poor economic returns, a lot of cash, and a low stock price will attract corporate traders, which often is the beginning of the end of current management tenure. To protect themselves, executives frequently choose the second option instead, purchasing growth by acquiring another company. Announcing acquisition plans excites shareholders and dissuades corporate traders. However, Buffett is skeptical of companies that need to buy growth. For one thing, it often comes at an overvalued price. For another, a company that must integrate and manage a new business is apt to make mistakes that could be costly to shareholders. In Buffett's mind, the only reasonable and responsible course for companies that have a growing pile of cash that cannot be reinvested at above-average rates is to return that money to the shareholders. For that, two methods are available: raising the dividend or buying back shares. With cash in hand from their dividends, shareholders have the opportunity to look elsewhere for higher returns. On the surface, this seems to be a good deal, and therefore many people view increased dividends as a sign of companies that are doing well. Buffett believes that this is so only if investors can get more for their cash than the company could generate if it retained the earnings and reinvested in the company. Over the years, Berkshire Hathaway has earned very high returns from its capital and has retained all its earnings. With such high returns, shareholders would have been ill-served if they were paid a dividend. Not surprisingly, Berkshire does not pay a dividend. And that's just fine with the shareholders. The ultimate test of owners' faith is allowing management to reinvest 100% of earnings. Berkshire's owners' faith in Buffett is high. If the real value of dividends is sometimes misunderstood, the second mechanism for returning earnings to the shareholders, stock repurchase, is even more so. The benefit to the owners is in many respects less direct, less tangible, and less immediate. When management repurchases stock, Buffett feels that the reward is twofold. If the stock is selling below its intrinsic value, then purchasing shares makes good business sense. If a company's stock price is $50 and its intrinsic value is $100, then each time management buys its stock, they are acquiring $2 of intrinsic value for every $1 spent. Such transactions can be highly profitable for the remaining shareholders. Furthermore, says Buffett, when executives actively buy the company's stock in the market, they are demonstrating that they have the best interests of their owners at hand rather than a careless need to expand the corporate structure. That kind of stance sends good signals to the market, attracting other investors looking for a well-managed company that increases shareholders' wealth. Frequently, shareholders are rewarded twice, first from the initial open market purchase and then subsequently from the positive effect of investor interest on price. Coca-Cola growth and net cash flow has allowed Coca-Cola to increase its dividend to shareholders and also repurchase its shares in the open market. In 1984, the company authorized its first ever buyback, announcing it would repurchase 6 million shares of stock. Since then, the company has repurchased more than 1 billion shares. This represented 32% of the shares outstanding as of January 1, 1984. At an average price per share of $12.46. In other words, the company spent approximately $12.40 billion to buy in shares that only 10 years later would have a market value of approximately $60 billion. In July 1992, the company announced that through the year 2000, it would buy back 100 million shares of its stock, representing 7.6% of the company's outstanding shares. Remarkably, because of its strong cash-generating abilities, the company was able to accomplish this while it continued its aggressive investment in overseas markets. American Express Buffett's association with American Express dates back some 40 years, to his bold purchase of its distressed stock in 1963, and the astronomical profits he quickly earned for his investment partners. See Chapter 1 for the full story. Buffett's faith in the company has not diminished, and he has continued to purchase its stock. A big buy in 1994 can be traced to management decisions, both good and bad, about the use of excess cash. The division of the company that issues the charge card and traveler's checks, American Express Travel-Related Services, contributes the lion's share of profits. It has always generated substantial owner earnings and has easily funded its own growth. In the early 1990s, it was generating more cash than it needed for operations, the very point at which management actions collide with Buffett's acid test. In this case, American Express management did not do well. Then CEO James Robinson decided to use excess cash to build the company into a financial services powerhouse by buying other related businesses. His first acquisition, IDS Financial Services, proved profitable. But then he bought Shearson Lehman, which did not. Over time, Shearson needed more and more cash to carry its operations. When Shearson had swallowed up $4 billion, Robinson contacted Buffett, who agreed to buy $300 million worth of preferred shares. Until the company got back on track, he was not at all interested in buying common stock. In 1992, Robinson abruptly resigned and was replaced by Harvey Golub. He set himself the immediate task of strengthening brand awareness. Striking a familiar tone with Buffett, he began using terms such as franchise and brand value to describe the American Express card. Over the next 2 years, Golub began to liquidate the company's underperforming assets and to restore profitability and higher returns on equity. One of his first actions was to get rid of Shearson Lehman, with its massive capital needs. Soon American Express was showing signs of its old profitable self. The resources of the company were solidly behind Golub's goal of building the American Express card into the world's most respected service brand, and every communication from the company emphasized the franchise value of the name American Express. Next, Golub set financial targets for the company, to increase earnings per share by 12 to 15% a year and 18 to 20% return on equity. Before long, the company was again generating excess cash and had more capital and more shares than it needed. Then, in September 1994, the company announced that, subject to market conditions, it planned to repurchase 20 million shares of its common stock. That was music to Buffett's ears. That summer, Buffett had converted Berkshire's holdings in preferred stock to common, and soon thereafter, he began to acquire even more. By the end of the year, Berkshire owned 27 million shares. In March 1995, Buffett added another 20 million shares. In 1997, another 49.5 million, and 50.5 million more in 1998. At the end of 2003, Berkshire owned more than 151 million shares of American Express stock, nearly 12% of the company, with a market value of more than $7 billion, 7 times what Buffett paid for it. The Washington Post Company. The Washington Post generates substantial cash flow for its owners, more than can be reinvested in its primary businesses. So its management is confronted with two rational choices: return the money to shareholders and/or profitably invest the cash in new investment opportunities. As we know, Buffett prefers to have companies return excess earnings to shareholders. The Washington Post Company, while Katharine Graham was president, was the first newspaper company in its industry to repurchase shares in large quantities. Between 1975 and 1991, the company bought an unbelievable 43% of its shares at an average price of $60 per share. A company can also choose to return money to shareholders by increasing the dividend. In 1990, confronted with substantial cash reserves, the Washington Post voted to increase the annual dividend to its shareholders from $1.84 to $4, a 117% increase. See Figure 6.1. In addition to returning excess cash to its owners, the Washington Post has made several profitable business purchases: cable properties from capital cities, cellular telephone companies, and television stations. Don Graham, who now runs the company, is continually beset with offers To further his goal of developing substantial cash flows at favorable investment costs, he has developed specific guidelines for evaluating those offers. He looks for a business that has competitive barriers, does not require extensive capital expenditures, and has reasonable pricing power. Furthermore, he notes, we have a strong preference for businesses we know, and given the choice, we're more likely to invest in a handful of big bets rather than spread our investment dollars around thinly. 9. Graham's acquisition approach mimics Buffett's strategy at Berkshire Hathaway. The dynamics of the newspaper business have changed in recent years. Earlier, when the economy slowed and advertisers cut spending, newspapers could maintain profitability by raising lineage rates. But today's advertisers have found cheaper ways to reach their customers: cable television, direct mail, and newspaper inserts. Newspapers are no longer monopolies, they have lost their pricing flexibility. Even so, Buffett is convinced that the Post is in better shape than other media companies. There are 2 reasons for his optimism. First, the Post's long-term debt was more than offset by its cash holdings. The Washington Post is the only public newspaper that is essentially free of debt. As a result, explains Buffett, the shrinkage in the value of their assets has not been accentuated by the effects of leverage. 10. He notes, the Washington Post Company has been exceptionally well managed. The pampered chef Doris Christopher, the founder, chairman and CEO of the Pampered Chef, has allocated her capital well, financing all expansion and growth through internal earnings. She has reinvested virtually all her profits in the company, and the resulting expansion has brought tremendous growth in sales. Between 1995 and 2001, the Pampered Chef's business grew an astonishing 232%, with pre-tax profit margins above 25%. And the only debt the company ever had was the original $3,000 seed money that Christopher borrowed from her life insurance policy. From all appearances, Doris Christopher is a careful and profitable manager, and she runs a tight ship. She displays keen management intuition by treating her representatives well but competitively. The Pampered Chef's direct marketers across the country are the bread and butter of the business and the company's only direct contact with its over 12 million customers. The sales force earns commissions of 18 to 20% on goods they sell, and 1 to 4% on the sales of kitchen consultants whom they bring into the company. Candor. Buffett holds in high regard managers who report their company's financial performance fully and genuinely, who admit mistakes as well as share successes, and who are in all ways candid with shareholders. In particular, he respects managers who are able to communicate the performance of their company without hiding behind generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. Financial accounting standards only require disclosure of business information classified by industry segment. Some managers exploit this minimum requirement and lump together all the company's businesses into one industry segment, making it difficult for owners to understand the dynamics of their separate business interests. What needs to be reported, Buffett insists, is data, whether GAAP, non-GAAP, or extra GAAP, that helps the financially literate readers answer 3 key questions. 1. Approximately how much is this company worth? 2. What is the likelihood that it can meet its future obligations? And 3. How good a job are its managers doing, given the hand they have been dealt? Berkshire Hathaway's own annual reports are a good example. They meet GAAP obligations, but they go much further. Buffett includes the separate earnings of each of Berkshire's businesses and any other additional information that he feels owners would deem valuable when judging a company's economic performance. Buffett admires CEOs who are able to report to their shareholders in the same candid fashion. He also admires those with the courage to discuss failure openly. He believes that managers who confess mistakes publicly are more likely to correct them. According to Buffett, most annual reports are a sham. Over time, every company makes mistakes, both large and inconsequential. Too many managers, he believes, report with excess optimism instead of honest explanation, serving perhaps their own interests in the short term but no one's interests in the long run. Buffett credits Charlie Munger with helping him understand the value of studying one's mistakes instead of concentrating only on success. In his annual reports to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders, Buffett is open about Berkshire's economic and management performance, both good and bad. Through the years, he has admitted the difficulties that Berkshire encountered in both the textile and insurance businesses and his own management failures with these businesses. His self-criticism is blunt and unstinting. The merger with General Re Reinsurance Company in 1998 brought significant trouble, a good deal of which remained undiagnosed for several years, and came to light only in the wake of the World Trade Center bombing in 2001. At the time of the merger, Buffett said later, he thought the reinsurance company operated with the same discipline he demanded of other Berkshire insurance companies. "I was dead wrong," he admitted in 2002. There was much to do at that company to get it up to snuff. 12. The General Re problem was not limited to its insurance practices. The company also had a division that dealt in trading and derivatives, a business Buffett considered unattractive at the time of the merger, although, as part of the package, unavoidable, and financially disastrous several years later. In 2003, he wrote this straightforward apology to shareholders: "I'm sure I could have saved you $100 million or so, if I had acted more promptly to shut down General Re Securities." Charlie would have moved swiftly to close it down, no question about that. I, however, dithered. As a consequence, our shareholders are paying a far higher price than was necessary to exit this business. Critics have argued that Buffett's practice of publicly admitting his mistakes is made easier because, since he owns such a large share of Berkshire's common stock, he never has to worry about being fired. This is true. But it does not diminish the fundamental value of Buffett's belief that candor benefits the manager at least as much as it benefits the shareholder. "The CEO who misleads others in public," he says, "may eventually mislead himself in private." 14. Coca-Cola. Roberto Goizueta's strategy for strengthening Coca-Cola when he took over as CEO pointedly included shareholders. "We shall, during the next decade, remain totally committed to our shareholders and to the protection and enhancement of their investment," he wrote. "In order to give our shareholders an above-average total return on their investment, we must choose businesses that generate returns in excess of inflation." 15. Goizueta not only had to grow the business, which required capital investment, he was also obliged to increase shareholder value. By increasing profit margins and return on equity, Coca-Cola was able to increase dividends while simultaneously reducing the dividend payout ratio. Dividends to shareholders, in the 1980s, were increasing 10% per year while the payout ratio was declining from 65% to 40%. This enabled Coca-Cola to reinvest a greater percentage of the company's earnings to help sustain its growth rate without shortchanging shareholders. Coca-Cola is undeniably a superior company with an outstanding historical economic performance record. In the most recent years, however, that level of growth has moderated. Where some shareholders might have panicked, Buffett did not. He did not, in fact, do anything. He didn't sell even one share. It is a clear testament to his belief in the company, and a clear illustration of staying true to his principles. The institutional imperative: if management stands to gain wisdom and credibility by facing mistakes, why do so many annual reports trumpet only successes? If allocation of capital is so simple and logical, why is capital so poorly allocated? The answer, Buffett has learned, is an unseen force he calls the institutional imperative, the lemming-like tendency of corporate management to imitate the behavior of other managers, no matter how silly or irrational that behavior may be. He says it was the most surprising discovery of his business career. At school, he was taught that experienced managers were honest, intelligent, and automatically made rational business decisions. Once out in the business world, he learned instead that rationality frequently wilts when the institutional imperative comes into play. 16. Buffett believes that the institutional imperative is responsible for several serious, but distressingly common, conditions. 1. The organization resists any change in its current direction. 2. Just as work expands to fill available time, corporate projects or acquisitions will materialize to soak up available funds. 3. Any business craving of the leader, however foolish, will quickly be supported by detailed rate of return and strategic studies prepared by his troops. And 4. The behavior of peer companies, whether they are expanding, acquiring, setting executive compensation or whatever, will be mindlessly imitated. 17. Buffett learned this lesson early. Jack Ringwald, head of National Indemnity, which Berkshire acquired in 1967, helped Buffett discover the destructive power of the imperative. While the majority of insurance companies were writing insurance policies on terms guaranteed to produce inadequate returns or worse, a loss, Ringwald stepped away from the market and refused to write new policies. For the full story, refer to Chapter 3. Buffett recognized the wisdom of Ringwald's decisions and followed suit. Today, Berkshire's insurance companies still operate on this principle. What is behind the institutional imperative that drives so many businesses? Human nature. Most managers are unwilling to look foolish and expose their company to an embarrassing quarterly loss when other lemming companies are still able to produce quarterly gains, even though they assuredly are heading into the sea. Shifting direction is never easy. It is often easier to follow other companies down the same path toward failure than to alter the direction of the company. Admittedly, Buffett and Munger enjoy the same protected position here as in their freedom to be candid about bad news. They don't have to worry about getting fired, and this frees them to make unconventional decisions. Still, a manager with strong communication skills should be able to convince owners to accept a short-term loss in earnings and a change in the direction of their company if it means superior results over time. Inability to resist the institutional imperative, Buffett has learned, often has less to do with the owners of the company than the willingness of its managers to accept fundamental change. Even when managers accept the notion that their company must radically change or face the possibility of shutting down, carrying out this plan is too difficult for most managers. Many succumb to the temptation to buy a new company instead of facing the financial facts of the current problem. Why would they do this? Buffett isolates 3 factors he feels most influence management's behavior. First, most managers cannot control their lust for activity. Such hyperactivity often finds its outlet in busyness takeovers. Second, most managers are constantly comparing the sales, earnings, and executive compensation of their business with other companies in and beyond their industry. These comparisons invariably invite corporate hyperactivity. Lastly, Buffett believes that most managers have an exaggerated sense of their own management capabilities. Another common problem is poor allocation skills. As Buffett points out, CEOs often rise to their position by excelling in other areas of the company, including administration, engineering, marketing, or production. Because they have little experience in allocating capital, most CEOs instead turn to their staff members, consultants, or investment bankers. Here the institutional imperative begins to enter the decision-making process. Buffett points out that if the CEO craves a potential acquisition requiring a 15% return on investment to justify the purchase, it is amazing how smoothly his troops report back to him that the business can actually achieve 15.1%. The final justification for the institutional imperative is mindless imitation. If companies A, B, and C are all doing the same thing, well then, reasons the CEO of Company D, it must be alright for our company to behave the same way. It is not venality or stupidity, Buffett believes, that positions these companies to fail. Rather, it is the institutional dynamics of the imperative that make it difficult to resist doomed behavior. Speaking before a group of Notre Dame students, Buffett displayed a list of 37 failed investment banking firms. All of them, he explained, failed even though the volume of the New York Stock Exchange had multiplied 15-fold. These firms were headed by hardworking individuals with very high IQs, all of whom had an intense desire to succeed. Buffett paused, his eyes scanned the room. "You think about that," he said sternly. "How could they get a result like that?" "I'll tell you how," he said, mindless imitation of their peers. 18. Coca-Cola. When Goizueta took over Coca-Cola, one of his first moves was to jettison the unrelated businesses that the previous CEO had developed and return the company to its core business, selling syrup. It was a clear demonstration of Coca-Cola's ability to resist the institutional imperative. Reducing the company to a single-product business was undeniably a bold move. What made Goizueta's strategy even more remarkable was his willingness to take this action at a time when others in the industry were doing the exact opposite. Several leading beverage companies were investing their profits in other unrelated businesses. Anheuser-Busch used the profits from its beer business to invest in theme parks. Brown-Forman, a producer and distributor of wine and spirits, invested its profits in China, crystal, silver, and luggage businesses, all of them with much lower returns. Seagram Company, Ltd., a global spirits and wine business, bought Universal Studios. Pepsi, Coca-Cola's chief beverage rival, bought snack businesses, Frito-Lay, and restaurants including Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Pizza Hut. Not only did Goizueta's action focus the company's attention on its largest and most important product, but it worked to reallocate the company's resources into its most profitable business. Since the economic returns of selling syrup far outweighed the economic returns of the other businesses, the company was now reinvesting its profits in its highest returning business. Clayton Homes. In an industry that is strangled by problems of its own making, Clayton stands out for its strong management and smart business model. Manufactured homes now constitute 15% of the total housing units in the United States. In many respects, their historically negative image is disappearing. The homes are becoming more like site-built homes in size and scope, construction quality has consistently improved, they are competitive with rentals, they have tax advantages in that owners do not have to own the underlying property, and mortgages are now supported by other large mortgage companies and government agencies, such as Fannie Mae. Still, since they are considerably less expensive than site-built homes, 2002 average prices, $48,800 compared with $164,217, the primary market remains consumers toward the lower end of the economic range. In 2002, over 22 million Americans lived in manufactured homes, with a median family income of $26,900.19. Many manufacturers were caught in a self-inflicted double bind in the 1990s, and many of them failed. One arm of this double bind was the increasing acceptance and popularity of these homes, which rushed many in the industry toward overexpansion. The other squeeze factor was simple greed. The homes are sold through retailers that are either independent dealers representing several manufacturers or company-owned outlets. Right there, on the same lot, shoppers usually find a financing operation, often a subsidiary of the manufacturer, retailer. In and of itself, there is nothing wrong with this, it sounds like, and in fact operates like, a car dealership. The problem is that it has become endemic in the industry to push sales to anybody who can sign their name to a sales agreement, regardless of credit history, based on loans that are destined to default. Selling scads of units creates immediate profits for the retailers and huge commissions for the salespeople. It also creates enormous economic problems longer range. It is an unfortunate reality that many homes are sold to people with fragile economic circumstances, and repossession rates are high, which reduces the demand for new homes. As unemployment rates rose in the past few years, so did loan delinquencies. Factor in the oversupply of inventory from the 1990s, and the tight economic times that diminished spending across the board, and it adds up to a sorry state of affairs for the industry as a whole. Much of the problem can be traced to the very weak loans that are so common in the manufactured home business. Why do they all do it? Because they all do it, and each company fears losing market share if it does otherwise. That, in a nutshell, is the curse of the institutional imperative. Clayton has not been completely immune, but it has avoided the most egregious faults. Most importantly, Clayton compensates its salespeople in a different way. The commissions of sellers and managers are based not only on the number of homes sold but also on the quality and performance of the loans made. Sales staff share the financial burden when loan payments are missed, and share the revenue when the loan performs well. Take, for example, a sales manager who handles the sale and financing of a $24,000 mobile home. If the customer cannot make the payments, Clayton would typically lose $2,500, and the manager is responsible for up to half the loss. 20 But if the loan performs, the manager shares up to half of that, too. That puts the burden to avoid weak loans on the sales personnel. The methodology paid off. In 2002, only 2.3% of the homeowners with a Clayton mortgage are 30 days delinquent. 21 That is roughly half the industry delinquency rate. In the late 1990s, when more than 80 factories and 4,000 retailers went out of business, Clayton closed only 31 retailers and did not shut any factories. By 2003, when Buffett entered the picture, Clayton had emerged from the downturn in the economy in general and the mobile home industry in particular stronger and better positioned than any of its competitors. Warren Buffett bought Clayton Homes because he saw in Jim Clayton a hard-working self-starter with strong management skills and a lot of smarts. Clayton showed not once but twice that he could weather a downturn in the industry by structuring his business model in a way that avoided an especially damaging institutional imperative. The Washington Post company Buffett has told us that even third-rate newspapers can earn substantial profits. Since the market does not require high standards of a paper, it is up to management to impose its own. And it is management's high standards and abilities that can differentiate the business's returns when compared with its peer group. In 1973, if Buffett had invested in Gannett, Knight Ridder, the New York Times, or Times Mirror the same $10 million he did in the Post, his investment returns would have been above average, reflecting the exceptional economics of the newspaper business during this period. But the extra $200, $300 million in market value that the Washington Post gained over its peer group, Buffett says, came, in very large part, from the superior nature of the managerial decisions made by Katharine Graham, as compared to those made by managers of most other media companies. 22 Katharine Graham had the brains to purchase large quantities of the Post's stock at bargain prices. She also had the courage, he said, to confront the labor unions, reduce expenses, and increase the business value of the paper. Washington Post shareholders are fortunate that Katharine Graham positioned the company so favorably. Warren Buffett on management, ethics, and rationality in all his communications with Berkshire shareholders, and indeed with the world at large, Buffett has consistently emphasized his search for honest and straightforward managers. He believes that not only are these binding corporate values in today's world, they are also pivotal issues that determine a company's ultimate success and profitability in the long term. Executive compensation, stock options, director independence, accounting trickery, these issues strike a very personal chord with Buffett, and he does not hesitate to let us know how he feels. CEO Avarice and the Institutional Imperative. In his 2001 letter to shareholders, Buffett wrote, "Charlie and I are disgusted by the situation, so common in the last few years, in which shareholders have suffered billions in losses while the CEOs, promoters and other higher-ups who fathered these disasters have walked away with extraordinary wealth. Indeed, many of these people were urging investors to buy shares while concurrently dumping their own, sometimes using methods that hid their actions. To their shame, these business leaders view shareholders as patsies, not partners. There is no shortage of egregious conduct in corporate America. 24 The accounting scandals set off alarm bells across the United States, especially for anyone who held stock in a company 401k plan. Shareholders started asking questions and wondering if their companies were managing their affairs honestly and transparently. We all became increasingly aware that there were major problems in the system. CEOs were getting huge paychecks while using company money for private jets and ostentatious parties, and directors were often rubber-stamping whatever decisions management decided to take. It seemed as if not one CEO could resist the temptation to get in on the enormous salaries and extravagant lifestyles enjoyed by others. That is the institutional imperative at its most destructive. Things have not improved much, according to Buffett. In his 2003 letter to shareholders, he lambasted the seemingly unabated epidemic of greed. He wrote, "Overreaching by CEOs greatly accelerated in the 1990s as compensation packages gained by the most avaricious, a title for which there was vigorous competition, were promptly replicated elsewhere." In judging whether corporate America is serious about reforming itself, CEO pay remains the acid test. To date, the results aren't encouraging. 25 This from a man who has no stock options and still pays himself $100,000 a year. Stock options. In addition to these lofty salaries, executives of publicly traded companies are customarily rewarded with fixed-price stock options, often tied to corporate earnings but very seldom tied to the executive's actual job performance. This goes against the grain for Buffett. When stock options are passed out indiscriminately, he says, managers with below-average performance are rewarded just as generously as the managers who have had excellent performance. In Buffett's mind, even if your team wins the pennant, you don't pay a .350 hitter the same as a .150 hitter. At Berkshire, Buffett uses a compensation system that rewards managers for performance. The reward is not tied to the size of the enterprise, the individual's age, or Berkshire's overall profits. Buffett believes that good unit performance should be rewarded whether Berkshire's stock price rises or falls. Instead, executives are compensated based on their success at meeting performance goals keyed to their area of responsibility. Some managers are rewarded for increasing sales, others for reducing expenses or curtailing capital expenditures. At the end of the year, Buffett does not hand out stock options, he writes checks. Some are quite large. Managers can use the cash as they please. Many use it to purchase Berkshire stock. Even when stock options are treated as a legitimate aspect of executive compensation, Buffett cautions us to watch how they are accounted for on a company's balance sheet. He believes they should be considered an expense so that their effect on reported earnings is clear. This seems so obvious as to be unarguable. Sadly, not all companies see it this way. In Buffett's mind, this is another facet of the ready acceptance of excessive pay. In his 2003 letter to shareholders, he wrote, "When CEOs or their representatives meet with compensation committees, too often one side, the CEOs, has cared far more than the other about what bargain is struck. A CEO, for example, will always regard the difference between receiving options for 100,000 shares or for 500,000 as monumental. To a comp committee, however, the difference may seem unimportant, particularly if, as has been the case at most companies, neither grant will have any effect on reported earnings. Under these conditions, the negotiation often has a play money quality." 26 Buffett's strong feelings about this subject can be seen in his response to Amazon's announcement in April 2003 that it would start expensing stock options. Buffett wrote to CEO Jeff Bezos that it took particular courage and his decision would be recognized and remembered. 27 A week later, Buffett bought $98.3 million of Amazon's high-yield bonds. Malfeasant accounting and shady financing issues. Anyone who was reading a daily newspaper in the second half of 2001 could not help but be aware of the growing tide of corporate wrongdoing. For months, We all watched with something amounting to horror as one scandal followed another, involving some of the best-known names in American industry. All came to be lumped under the umbrella term accounting scandal because the misdeeds centered on accounting trickery and because the outside auditors who were supposed to verify the accounting reports were themselves named as parties to the actions. It's far broader than accounting, of course. It's about greed, lies, and criminal acts. But accounting reports are a good place to look for signs of trouble. In his 2002 letter to shareholders, Buffett warned investors to be careful in reading annual reports. If you've been a reader of financial reports in recent years, he wrote, you've seen a flood of pro forma earnings statements, tabulations in which managers invariably show earnings far in excess of those allowed by their auditors. In these presentations, the CEO tells his owners, don't count this, don't count that, just count what makes earnings fat. Often, a forget all this bad stuff message is delivered year after year without management so much as blushing. 29 Buffett is plainly disgusted by the scandals. The blatant wrongdoing that has occurred has betrayed the trust of so many millions of shareholders. He blames the heady days of the 1990s, the get-rich-quick period he calls the Great Bubble, for the deterioration of corporate ethics. As stock prices went up, he says, the behavioral norms of managers went down. By the late 90s, CEOs who traveled the high road did not encounter heavy traffic. Too many have behaved badly, fudging numbers and drawing obscene pay for mediocre business achievements. 30 And in too many cases, their company's directors, charged with upholding shareholder interests, failed miserably. Director negligence and corporate governance. Part of the problem, Buffett suggests, is the shameful tendency of boards of directors to blithely rubber stamp whatever senior management asks for. It is a question of independence and guts, the degree to which directors are willing to honor their fiduciary responsibility at the risk of displeasing the senior executives. That willingness, or lack of it, is on display in boardrooms across the country. True independence, meaning the willingness to challenge a forceful CEO when something is wrong or foolish, is an enormously valuable trait in a director, Buffett writes. It is also rare. The place to look for it is among high-grade people whose interests are in line with those of rank-and-file shareholders. Buffett illuminates his position by describing what he looks for in members of the Berkshire Hathaway board: very high integrity, business savvy, shareholder orientation and a genuine interest in the company. 31 Can we really put the value on management? Buffett would be the first to admit that evaluating managers along his three dimensions, rationality, candor, and independent thinking, is more difficult than measuring financial performance, for the simple reason that human beings are more complex than numbers. Indeed, many analysts believe that because measuring human activity is vague and imprecise, we simply cannot value management with any degree of confidence, and therefore the exercise is futile. Without a decimal point, they seem to suggest, there is nothing to measure. Others hold the view that the value of management is fully reflected in the company's performance statistics, including sales, profit margins, and return on equity, and no other measuring stick is necessary. Both opinions have some validity, but neither is strong enough to outweigh the original premise. The reason for taking the time to evaluate management is that it gives you early warning signs of eventual financial performance. If you look closely at the words and actions of a management team, you will find clues that can help you measure the value of their work long before it shows up in the company's financial reports or in the stock pages of your daily newspaper. Doing so will take some digging on your part, and that may be enough to discourage the weak of heart or the lazy. That is their loss, and your gain. How to go about gathering the necessary information. Buffett offers a few tips. He suggests reviewing annual reports from a few years back, paying special attention to what management said then about strategies for the future. Then compare those plans to today's results. How fully were they realized? Also compare strategies of a few years ago to this year's strategies and ideas. How has the thinking changed? Buffett also suggests that it can be very valuable to compare annual reports of the company you are interested in with reports from similar companies in the same industry. It is not always easy to find exact duplicates, but even relative performance comparison can yield insights. Expand your reading horizons. Be alert for articles in newspapers and financial magazines about the company you are interested in and about its industry in general. Read what the company's executives have to say and what others say about them. If you notice that the chairman recently made a speech or presentation, get a copy from the Investor Relations Department and study it carefully. Make use of the company's web pages for up-to-the-minute information. In every way you can think of, raise your antennae. The more you develop the habit of staying alert for information, the easier the process will become. It must be said here, with sadness, that it is possible that the documents you study are filled with inflated numbers, half-truths, and deliberate obfuscations. We all know the names of the companies charged with doing this. They are a rogues gallery of American businesses, and some of their leaders are finding themselves with lots of time in prison to rethink their actions. Sometimes the manipulations are so skillful that even forensic accountants are fooled. How then can you, an investor without any special knowledge, fully understand what you are seeing? The regrettable answer is, you cannot. You can learn how to read annual reports and balance sheets, and you should, but if they are based on flagrant deception and lies, you might not be able to detect it. I do not mean to say that you should simply give up. Keep doing your research, and strive to be alert for signs of trouble. It should not surprise us that Warren Buffett gives us some valuable tips. 33, beware of companies displaying weak accounting. In particular, he cautions us to watch out for companies that do not expense stock options. It's an obvious red flag that other less obvious maneuvers are also present. Another red flag, unintelligible footnotes. If you can't understand them, he says, don't assume it's your shortcoming. It's a favored tool for hiding something management doesn't want you to know. Be suspicious of companies that trumpet earnings projections and growth expectations. No one can know the future, and any CEO who claims to do so is not worthy of your trust. In conclusion, Buffett wants to work with managers who are straight shooters, who are candid with their shareholders and their employees. His unshakable insistence on ethical behavior as a condition of doing business has taken on added significance since the outbreak of corporate scandals. However, he would be the first to acknowledge that taking such a stand will not, in and of itself, insulate investors from losses triggered by fraud. I must add my own caution. I cannot promise that following the tenets of the Warren Buffett way described in this book will protect you 100%. If company officials are flat out lying to investors through fraudulent accounting or other illegal maneuvers, and if they're good at it, it can be difficult, often impossible, to detect in time. Even to Ollie, the perpetrators end up in jail, but by then the damage to shareholders is done, the money is gone. What I can say is this: if you adopt the careful, thoughtful way of looking at investments that Buffett teaches us and take the time to do your homework, you will be right more often than you are wrong, and certainly more often than those who allow themselves to be pushed and pulled willy-nilly by headlines and rumor. 7. Investing Guidelines, Financial Tenets. The financial tenets by which Buffett values both managerial excellence and economic performance are all grounded in some typically Buffett-like principles. For one thing, he does not take yearly results too seriously. Instead, he focuses on 4 or 5-year averages. Often, he notes, profitable business returns might not coincide with the time it takes for the planet to circle the sun. He also has little patience with accounting sleight of hand that produces impressive year-end numbers but little real value. Instead, he relies on a few timeless financial principles: focus on return on equity, not earnings per share. Calculate owner earnings to get a true reflection of value. Look for companies with high profit margins. For every dollar retained, has the company created at least $1 of market value? Return on equity customarily, Analysts measure annual company performance by looking at earnings per share. Did they increase over the preceding year? Are they high enough to brag about? For his part, Buffett considers earnings per share a smokescreen. Since most companies retain a portion of their previous year's earnings to increase their equity base, he sees no reason to get excited about record earnings per share. There is nothing spectacular about a company that increases earnings per share by 10% if at the same time it is growing its equity base by 10%. That's no different, he explains, from putting money in a savings account and letting the interest accumulate and compound. The test of economic performance, Buffett believes, is whether a company achieves a high earnings rate on equity capital, without undue leverage, accounting gimmickry, etc., not whether it has consistent gains in earnings per share. 1. To measure a company's annual performance, Buffett prefers return on equity, the ratio of operating earnings to shareholders' equity. To use this ratio, though, we need to make several adjustments. First, all marketable securities should be valued at cost and not at market value, because values in the stock market as a whole can greatly influence the returns on shareholders' equity in a particular company. For example, if the stock market rose dramatically in one year, thereby increasing the net worth of a company, a truly outstanding operating performance would be diminished when compared with a larger denominator. Conversely, falling prices reduce shareholders' equity, which means that mediocre operating results appear much better than they really are. Second, we must also control the effects that unusual items may have on the numerator of this ratio. Buffett excludes all capital gains and losses as well as any extraordinary items that may increase or decrease operating earnings. He is seeking to isolate the specific annual performance of a business. He wants to know how well management accomplishes its task of generating a return on the operations of the business given the capital it employs. That, he says, is the single best measure of management's economic performance. Furthermore, Buffett believes that a business should achieve good returns on equity while employing little or no debt. We know that companies can increase their return on equity by increasing their debt-to-equity ratio. Buffett is aware of this. But the idea of adding a couple of points to Berkshire Hathaway's return on equity simply by taking on more debt does not impress him. Good business or investment decisions, he says, will produce quite satisfactory economic results with no aid from leverage. 2. Furthermore, highly leveraged companies are vulnerable during economic slowdowns. Buffett does not give us any suggestions as to what debt levels are appropriate or inappropriate for a business. Different companies, depending on their cash flows, can manage different levels of debt. What Buffett does tell us is that a good business should be able to earn a good return on equity without the aid of leverage. Investors should be wary of companies that can earn good returns on equity only by employing significant debt. Coca-Cola in strategy for the 1980s, his plan for revitalizing the company, Goizueta pointed out that Coca-Cola would divest any business that no longer generated acceptable returns on equity. Any new business venture must have sufficient real growth potential to justify an investment. Coca-Cola was no longer interested in battling for share in a stagnant market. Increasing earnings per share and effecting increased return on equity are still the name of the game, Goizueta announced. 3. His words were followed by actions. Coca-Cola's wine business was sold to Seagram's in 1983. Although the company earned a respectable 20% return on equity during the 1970s, Goizueta was not impressed. He demanded better returns and the company obliged. By 1988, Coca-Cola's return on equity had increased to 31.8% by any measurement. Goizueta's Coca-Cola was doubling and tripling the financial accomplishments of the previous CEO. The results could be seen in the market value of the company. In 1980, Coca-Cola had a market value of $4.1 billion. By the end of 1987, even after the stock market crash in October, the market value had risen to $14.10 billion, see figure 7.2. In 7 years, Coca-Cola's market value rose at an average annual rate of 19.3%. The Washington Post Company. When Buffett purchased stock in the Washington Post in 1973, its return on equity was 15.7%. This was an average return for most newspapers and only slightly better than the Standard & Poor's Industrial Index. But within 5 years, the Post's return on equity doubled. By then, it was twice as high as the S&P Industrials and 50% higher than the average newspaper. Over the next 10 years, the Post Company maintained its supremacy, reaching a high of 36.3% return on equity in 1988. These above-average returns are more impressive when you observe that the company has, over time, purposely reduced its debt. In 1973, long-term debt to shareholders' equity stood at 37.2%, the second highest ratio in the newspaper group. Astonishingly, by 1978, Catherine Gran had reduced the company's debt by 70%. In 1983, long-term debt to equity was a low 2.7%, one-tenth the newspaper group average, yet the Post generated a return on equity 10% higher than these same companies. Owner earnings. Investors, Buffett warns, should be aware that accounting earnings per share represent the starting point for determining the economic value of a business, not the ending point. The first point to understand, he says, is that not all earnings are created equal. For companies with high assets to profits, he points out, tend to report ersatz earnings. Because inflation extracts a toll on asset-heavy businesses, the earnings of these businesses take on a mirage-like quality. Hence, accounting earnings are useful to the analyst only if they approximate the expected cash flow of the company. But even cash flow, Buffett warns, is not a perfect tool for measuring value. Often it misleads investors. Cash flow is an appropriate way to measure businesses that have large investments in the beginning and smaller outlays later on, such as real estate, gas fields, and cable companies. On the other hand, companies that require ongoing capital expenditures, such as manufacturers, are not accurately valued using only cash flow. A company's cash flow is customarily defined as net income after taxes plus depreciation, depletion, amortization, and other non-cash charges. The problem with this definition, Buffett explains, is that it leaves out a critical economic fact: capital expenditures. How much of the year's earnings must the company use for new equipment, plant upgrades, and other improvements to maintain its economic position and unit volume? According to Buffett, approximately 95% of U.S. businesses require capital expenditures that are roughly equal to their depreciation rates. You can defer capital expenditures for a year or so, he says, but if over a long period, you don't make the necessary improvements, your business will surely decline. These capital expenditures are as much an expense to a company as are labor and utility costs. Popularity of cash flow numbers heightened during the leveraged buyout period of the 1980s because the exorbitant prices paid for businesses were justified by a company's cash flow. Buffett believes that cash flow numbers are frequently used by marketers of business and securities to justify the unjustifiable and thereby sell what should be unsaleable. When earnings look inadequate to service debt of a junk bond or justify a foolish stock price, how convenient it becomes to focus on cash flow. 5. But you cannot focus on cash flow, Buffett cautions, unless you are willing to subtract the necessary capital expenditures. Instead of cash flow, Buffett prefers to use what he calls owner earnings, a company's net income plus depreciation, depletion, and amortization, less the amount of capital expenditures and any additional working capital that might be needed. It is not a mathematically precise measure, Buffett admits, for the simple reason that calculating future capital expenditures often requires rough estimates. Still, quoting Keynes, he says, "I would rather be vaguely right than precisely wrong." Coca-Cola. In 1973, owner earnings, net income plus depreciation minus capital expenditures, were $152 million. By 1980, owner earnings were $262 million, an 8% annual compounded growth rate. Then from 1981 through 1988, owner earnings grew from $262 million to $828 million, a 17.8% average annual compounded growth rate, see Figure 7.3. The growth in owner earnings is reflected in the share price of Coca-Cola. In the 10-year period from 1973 to 1982, the total return of Coca-Cola grew at a 6.3% average annual rate. Over the next 10 years, from 1983 to 1992, the total return grew at an average annual rate of 31.1%. Profit margins. Like Philip Fisher, Buffett is aware that great businesses make lousy investments if management cannot convert sales into profits. In his experience, managers of high-cost operations tend to find ways that continually add to overhead, whereas managers of low-cost operations are always finding ways to cut expenses. Buffett has little patience for managers who allow costs to escalate. Frequently these same managers have to initiate a restructuring program to bring down costs in line with sales. Each time a company announces a cost-cutting program, he knows this company has not figured out what expenses can do to a company's owners. The really good manager, Buffett says, does this not wake up in the morning and say, "This is the day I'm going to cut costs," any more than he wakes up and decides to practice breathing. 6. Buffett understands the right size staff for any business operation and believes that for every dollar of sales there is an appropriate level of expenses. He has singled out Carl Reichert and Paul Hazen at Wells Fargo for their relentless attack on unnecessary expenses. They abhor having a bigger headcount than is needed, he says, and attack costs as vigorously when profits are at record levels as when they are under pressure. 7. Buffett himself can be tough when it comes to costs and unnecessary expenses, and he is very sensitive about Berkshire's profit margins. Of course, Berkshire Hathaway is a unique corporation. The corporate staff at Kiewit Plaza would have difficulty fielding a softball team. Berkshire Hathaway does not have a legal department, a public or investor relations department. There are no strategic planning departments staffed with MBA-trained workers plotting mergers and acquisitions. The company's after-tax overhead corporate expense runs less than 1% of operating earnings. Compare this, says Buffett, with other companies that have similar earnings but 10% corporate expenses. Shareholders lose 9% in the value of their holdings simply because of corporate overhead. The pampered chef, as mentioned, Doris Christopher, founded her company with $3,000 borrowed against her family's life insurance policy, and she never took on further debt. Today her company has over $700 million in sales. Customers pay for products before delivery, so the company is a cash-positive business. Alan Luce, president of Luce & Associates in Orlando, Florida, a direct-selling consulting firm, has estimated pre-tax profit margins at above 25%. Coca-Cola in 1980, Coca-Cola's pre-tax profit margins were a low 12.9%. Margins had been falling for 5 straight years and were substantially below the company's 1973 margins of 18%. In Goizueta's first year, pre-tax margins rose to 13.7%. By 1988, when Buffett bought his Coca-Cola shares, margins had climbed to a record 19%. The Washington Post Company. 6 months after the Post Company went public in 1971, Catherine Gran met with Wall Street security analysts. The first order of bussiness, she told them, was to maximize profits from the company's existing operations. Profits continued to rise at the television stations and Newsweek, but profitability at the newspaper was leveling off. The primary reason, she said, was high production costs, namely wages. After the Post purchased the Times-Herald, profits at the company had surged. Each time the union struck the paper, 1949, 1958, 1966, 1968, 1969, Management had opted to pay their demands rather than risk a shutdown. During this time, Washington, D.C., was still a three-newspaper town. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, increasing wage costs dampened profits. This problem, Mrs. Graham told the analysts, was going to be solved. As union contracts began to expire in the 1970s, Mrs. Graham enlisted labor negotiators who took a hard line with the unions. In 1974, the company defeated a strike by the Newspaper Guild and, after lengthy negotiations, the printers settled on a new contract. In the early 1970s, Forbes had written, "The best that could be said about the Washington Post Company's performance was it rated a gentleman C in profitability." 8 pre-tax margins in 1973 were 10.8%, well below the company's historical 15% margins earned in the 1960s. After the successful renegotiation of the union contracts, the Post's fortunes improved. By 1978, profit margins had leaped to 19.3%, an 80% improvement within 5 years. Buffett's bet had paid off. By 1988, the Post's pre-tax margin reached a high of 31.8%, which compared favorably with its newspaper group average of 16.9% and the Standard & Poor's Industrial average of 8.6%. Although the company's margins have declined somewhat in recent years, they remain substantially higher than the industry average. The $1 premise: Buffett's goal is to select companies in which each dollar of retained earnings is translated into at least $1 of market value. This test can quickly identify companies whose managers, over time, have been able to optimally invest their company's capital. If retained earnings are invested in the company and produce above-average return, the proof will be a proportionally greater rise in the company's market value. In time, that is. Although the stock market will track business value reasonably well over long periods, in any one year, prices can gyrate widely for reasons other than value. The same is true for retained earnings, Buffett explains. If a company uses retained earnings unpredictably over an extended period, eventually the market, justifiably, will price its shares disappointingly. Conversely, if a company has been able to achieve above-average returns on augmented capital, the increased stock price will reflect that success. Buffett believes that if he has selected a company with favorable long-term economic prospects run by able and shareholder-oriented managers, the proof will be reflected in the increased market value of the company. And he uses a quick test: the increased market value should at the very least match the amount of retained earnings, dollar for dollar. If the value, as we have learned of one accounting scandal after another, it has become even more critical for investors to delve into these financial areas. There is no guarantee that through this effort you will fully uncover the truth, but you will have much greater chance of spotting phony numbers than if you do nothing. As Buffett remarks, managers that always promise to make the numbers will at some point make up the numbers. Your goal is to begin to learn to tell the difference. 8. Investing Guidelines, Value Tenets. All the principles embodied in the tenets described so far lead to one decision point: buying or not buying shares in a company. At that point, any investor must weigh two factors: is this company a good value, and is this a good time to buy it? That is the price favorable? The stock market establishes price. The investor determines value after weighing all the known information about a company's business, management, and financial traits. Price and value are not necessarily equal. As Warren Buffett often remarks, price is what you pay. Value is what you get. If the stock market were truly efficient, prices would instantaneously adjust to all available information. Of course, we know this does not occur. Stock prices move above and below company values for numerous reasons, not all of them logical. Theoretically, investors make their decisions based on the differences between price and value. If the price is lower than its per-share value, a rational investor will decide to buy. If the price is higher than value, any reasonable investor will pass. As the company moves through its economic life cycle, a savvy investor will periodically reassess the company's value in relation to market price and will buy, sell, or hold shares accordingly. In sum, then, rational investing has two components: 1. Determine the value of the business. 2. Buy only when the price is right, when the business is selling at a significant discount to its value. Calculate what the business is worth through the years. Financial analysts have used many formulas for determining the intrinsic value of a company. Some are fond of various shorthand methods: low price to earnings ratios, low price to book values, and high dividend yields. But the best system, according to Buffett, was determined more than 60 years ago by John Burr Williams. See Chapter 2. Buffett and many others use Williams's dividend discount model, presented in his book The Theory of Investment Value, as the best way to determine the value of a security. Paraphrasing Williams, Buffett tells us that the value of a business is the total of the net cash flows, owner earnings, expected to occur over the life of the business, discounted by an appropriate interest rate. He considers it simply the most appropriate yardstick with which to measure a basket of different investment types: government bonds, corporate bonds, common stocks, apartment buildings, oil wells, and farms. The mathematical exercise, Buffett tells us, is similar to valuing a bond. The bond market each day adds up the future coupons of a bond and discounts those coupons at the prevailing interest rate. That determines the value of the bond. To determine the value of a business, the investor estimates the coupons that the business will generate for a period into the future and then discounts all these coupons back to the present. So valued, Buffett says, all businesses, from manufacturers of buggy whips to operators of cellular telephones, become economic equals. To summarize, then, calculating the current value of a business means, first, estimating the total earnings that will likely occur over the life of the business, and then discounting that total backward to today. Keep in mind that for earnings Buffett uses owner earnings, net cash flow adjusted for capital expenditures, as described in Chapter 7, to estimate the total future earnings. We would apply all we had learned about the company's business characteristics, its financial health, and the quality of its managers, using the analysis principles described thus far. For the second part of the formula, we need only decide what the discount rate should be, more on that in a moment. Buffett is firm on one point: he looks for companies whose future earnings are as predictable, as certain, as the earnings of bonds. If the company has operated with consistent earnings power and if the business is simple and understandable, Buffett believes he can determine its future earnings with a high degree of certainty. If he is unable to project with confidence what the future cash flows of a business will be, he will not attempt to value the company. He'll simply pass. This is the distinction of Buffett's approach. Although he admits that Microsoft is a dynamic company and he regards Bill Gates highly as a manager, Buffett confesses he hasn't a clue how to estimate the future cash earnings of this company. This is what he means by the circle of competence. He does not know the technology industry well enough to project the long-term earnings potential of any company within it. This brings us to the second element in the formula: what is the appropriate discount rate? Buffett's answer is simple: the rate that would be considered risk-free. For many years, he used the rate then current for long-term government bonds. Because the certainty that the U.S. government will pay its coupon over the next 30 years is virtually 100%, we can say that this is a risk-free rate. When interest rates are low, Buffett adjusts the discount rate upward. When bond yields dipped below 7%, Buffett upped his discount rate to 10%, and that is what he commonly uses today. If interest rates work themselves higher over time, he has successfully matched his discount rate to the long-term rate. If they do not, he has increased his margin of safety by 3 additional points. Some academicians argue that no company, regardless of its strengths, can assure future cash earnings with the same certainty as a bond. Therefore, they insist, a more appropriate discount factor would be the risk-free rate of return plus an equity risk premium, added to reflect the uncertainty of the company's future cash flows. Buffett does not add a risk premium. Instead, he relies on his single-minded focus on companies with consistent and predictable earnings and on the margin of safety that comes from buying at a substantial discount in the first place. "I put a heavy weight on certainty," Buffett says. "If you do that, the whole idea of a risk factor doesn't make any sense to me." For Coca-Cola, when Buffett first purchased Coca-Cola in 1988, people asked, "Where is the value in Coke?" Why was Buffett willing to pay 5 times book value for a company with a 6.6% earning yield? Because, as he continuously reminds us, price tells us nothing about value, and he believed Coca-Cola was a good value. To begin with, the company was earning 31% return on equity while employing relatively little in capital investment. More important, Buffett could see the difference that Roberto Goizueta's management was making. Because Goizueta was selling off the poor-performing businesses and reinvesting the proceeds back into the higher-performing syrup business, Buffett knew the financial returns of Coca-Cola were going to improve. In addition, Goizueta was buying back shares of Coca-Cola in the market, thereby increasing the economic value of the business even more. All this went into Buffett's value calculation. Let's walk through the calculation with him. In 1988, owner earnings of Coca-Cola equaled $828 million. The 30-year U.S. Treasury bond, the risk-free rate, at that time traded near a 9% yield. So Coca-Cola's 1988 owner earnings, discounted by 9%, would produce an intrinsic value of $9.2 billion. When Buffett purchased Coca-Cola, the market value was $14.8 billion, 60% higher, which led some observers to think he had overpaid. But $9.2 billion represents the discounted value of Coca-Cola's then current owner earnings. If Buffett was willing to pay the higher price, it had to be because he perceived that part of the value of Coca-Cola was its future growth opportunities. When a company is able to grow owner earnings without additional capital, it is appropriate to discount owner earnings by the difference between the risk-free rate of return and the expected growth of owner earnings. Analyzing Coca-Cola, we find that owner earnings from 1981 through 1988 grew at a 17.8% annual rate, faster than the risk-free rate of return. When this occurs, analysts use a two-stage discount model. This model is a way of calculating future earnings when a company has extraordinary growth for a certain number of years and then a period of constant growth at a slower rate. We can use this two-stage process to calculate the 1988 present value of the company's future cash flows. See Table 8.1. First, assume that starting in 1988, Coca-Cola would be able to grow owner earnings at 15% per year for 10 years. This is a reasonable assumption, since that rate is lower than the company's previous 7-year average. By the 10th year, the $828 million owner earnings that we started with would have increased to $3.349 billion. Let's further assume that starting in the 11th year, growth rate will slow to 5% a year. Using a discount rate of 9%, the long-term bond rate at the time, we can back-calculate the intrinsic value of Coca-Cola in 1988, $48.377 billion. See Notes section at the end of this book for details of this calculation. 5. But what happens if we decide to be more conservative, and use different growth rate assumptions? If we assume that Coca-Cola can grow owner earnings at 12% for 10 years followed by 5% growth, the present value of the company discounted at 9% would be $38.163 billion. At 10% growth for 10 years and 5% thereafter, the value of Coca-Cola would be $32.497 billion. And if we assume only 5% throughout, the company would still be worth at least $20.7 billion, $828 million divided by 9 minus 5%, Gillette. Berkshire, as mentioned in Chapter 4, bought $600 million worth of convertible preferred stock in July 1989. After a 2-for-1 stock split in February 1991, Berkshire converted its preferred stock and received 12 million common shares, 11% of Gillette's shares outstanding. Now that Berkshire owned Gillette common yielding 1.7% versus the convertible preferred yielding 8.75%, its investment in Gillette was no longer a fixed income security with appreciation potential but a straight equity commitment. If Berkshire were to retain its common stock, Buffett needed to be convinced that Gillette was a good investment. We already know that Buffett understood the company and that the company's long-term prospects were favorable. Gillette's financial characteristics, including return on equity and pre-tax margins, were improving. The ability to increase prices, thereby boosting return on equity to above-average rates, signaled the company's growing economic goodwill. CEO Mockler was purposefully reducing Gillette's long-term debt and working hard to increase shareholder value. In short, the company met all the prerequisites for purchase. What remained for Buffett was to determine the company's value, to assure that Gillette was not overpriced. Gillette's owner earnings at year-end 1990 were $275 million and had grown at a 16% annual rate since 1987. Although this is too short a period to fully judge a company's growth, we can begin to make certain assumptions. In 1991, Buffett compared Gillette to Coca-Cola. "Coca-Cola and Gillette are two of the best companies in the world," he wrote, "and we expect their earnings to grow at hefty rates in the years ahead." In early 1991, the 30-year U.S. government bond was trading at an 8.62% yield. To be conservative, we can use a 9% discount rate to value Gillette. But like Coca-Cola, Gillette's potential growth of earnings exceeds the discount rate, so again we must use the two-stage discount model. If we assume a 15% annual growth for 10 years and 5% growth thereafter, discounting Gillette's 1990 owner earnings at 9%, the approximate value of Gillette is $16 billion. If we adjust the future growth rate downward to 12%, the value is approximately $12.6 billion. At 10% growth, the value would be $10.8 billion. At the very conservative 7% growth in owner earnings, the value of Gillette is at least $8.5 billion. The Washington Post Company in 1973, the total market value for the Washington Post was $80 million. Yet Buffett claims that most security analysts, media brokers, and media executives would have estimated WPC's intrinsic value at $400 to $500 million. 7. How did Buffett arrive at that estimate? Let us walk through the numbers, using Buffett's reasoning. We'll start by calculating owner earnings for that year. Net income, $13.3 million, plus depreciation and amortization, $3.7 million, minus capital expenditures, $6.6 million, yields 1973 owner earnings of $10.4 million. If we divide these earnings by the long-term U.S. government bond yield at the time, 6.81%, the value of the Washington Post reaches $150 million, almost twice the market value of the company but well short of Buffett's estimate. Buffett tells us that, over time, the capital expenditures of a newspaper will equal depreciation and amortization charges, and therefore net income should approximate owner earnings. Knowing this, we can simply divide net income by the risk-free rate and thus reach a valuation of $196 million. If we stop here, the assumption is that the increase in owner earnings will equal the rise in inflation. But we know that newspapers have unusual pricing power. Because most are monopolies in their community, they can raise their prices at rates higher than inflation. If we make one last assumption, that the Washington Post has the ability to raise real prices by 3%, the value of the company is closer to $350 million. Buffett also knew that the company's 10% pre-tax margins were below its 15% historical average margins, And he knew that Katharine Graham was determined that the Post would once again achieve these margins. If pre-tax margins improved to 15%, the present value of the company would increase by $135 million, bringing the total intrinsic value to $485 million. Wells Fargo. The value of a bank is the function of its net worth plus its projected earnings as a going concern. When Berkshire Hathaway began purchasing Wells Fargo in 1990, the company in the previous year had earned $600 million. The average yield on the 30-year U.S. government bond that year was approximately 8.5%. To remain conservative, we can discount Wells Fargo's 1989 $600 million earnings by 9% and value the bank at $6.6 billion. If the bank never earned another dime over $600 million a year for the next 30 years, it was worth at least $6.6 billion. When Buffett purchased Wells Fargo in 1990, he paid $58 per share for its stock. With 52 million shares outstanding, this was equivalent to paying $3 billion for the company, a 55% discount to its value. The debate in investment circles at the time centered on whether Wells Fargo, after taking into consideration all its loan problems, even had earnings power. The short sellers said it no, Buffett said yes. He knew full well that ownership of Wells Fargo carried some risk, but he felt confident in his analysis. His step-by-step thinking is a good model for everyone weighing the risk factor of an investment. He started with what he already knew. Carl Icahn, then chairman of Wells Fargo, had run the bank since 1983, with impressive results. Under his leadership, growth in earnings and return on equity were both above average and operating efficiencies were among the highest in the country. Icahn had also built a solid loan portfolio. Next, Buffett envisioned the events that would endanger the investment and came up with 3 possibilities, then tried to imagine the likelihood that they would occur. It is, in a real sense, an exercise in probabilities. The first possible risk was a major earthquake, which would wreak havoc on borrowers and in turn on their lenders. The second risk was broader, a systemic business contraction or financial panic so severe it would endanger almost every highly leveraged institution, no matter how intelligently run. Neither of those two could be ruled out entirely, of course, but Buffett concluded, based on best evidence, that the probability of either one was low. The third risk, and the one getting the most attention from the market at the time, was that real estate values in the West would tumble because of overbuilding and deliver huge losses to banks that have financed the expansion. How serious would that be? Buffett reasoned that a meaningful drop in real estate values should not cause major problems for a well-managed bank like Wells Fargo. Consider some mathematics, he explained. Buffett knew that Wells Fargo earned $1 billion pre-tax annually after expensing an average $300 million for loan losses. He figured if 10% of the bank's $48 billion in loans, not just commercial real estate loans but all the bank's loans, were problem loans in 1991 and produced losses, including interest, averaging 30% of the principal value of the loan, Wells Fargo would still break even. In Buffett's judgment, the possibility of this occurring was low. But even if Wells Fargo earned no money for a year, but merely broke even, Buffett would not flinch. A year like that, which we consider only a low-level possibility, not a likelihood, would not distress us. 9. The attraction of Wells Fargo intensified when Buffett was able to purchase shares at a 50% discount to their value. His bet paid off. By the end of 1993, Wells Fargo's share price reached $137 per share, nearly triple what Buffett originally paid. By at attractive prices focusing on businesses that are understandable, with enduring economics, run by shareholder-oriented managers, all those characteristics are important, Buffett says, but by themselves will not guarantee investment success. For that, he first has to buy at sensible prices, and then the company has to perform to his business expectations. The second zone is not always easy to control, but the first is. If the price isn't satisfactory, he passes. Buffett's basic goal is to identify businesses that earn above average returns, and then to purchase these businesses at prices below their indicated value. Graham taught Buffett the importance of buying a stock only when the difference between its price and its value represents a margin of safety. Today, this is still his guiding principle, even though his partner Charlie Munger has encouraged him toward occasionally paying more for outstanding companies. The margin of safety principle assists Buffett in two ways. First, it protects him from downside price risk. If he calculates that the value of a business is only slightly higher than its per-share price, he will not buy the stock. He reasons that if the company's intrinsic value were to dip even slightly, eventually the stock price would also drop, perhaps below what he paid for it. But when the margin between price and value is large enough, the risk of declining value is less. If Buffett is able to purchase a company at 75% of its intrinsic value, a 25% discount, and the value subsequently declines by 10%, his original purchase price will still yield an adequate return. The margin of safety also provides opportunities for extraordinary stock returns. If Buffett correctly identifies a company with above-average economic returns, the value of its stock over the long term will steadily march upward. If a company consistently earns 15% on equity, its share price will appreciate more each year than that of a company that earns 10% on equity. Additionally, if Buffett, by using the margin of safety, is able to buy this outstanding business at a significant discount to its intrinsic value, Berkshire will earn an extra bonus when the market corrects the price of the business. The market, like the Lord, helps those who help themselves, says Buffett. But unlike the Lord, the market does not forgive those who know not what they do. Coca-Cola. From the time that Roberto Goizueta took control of Coca-Cola in 1980, the company's stock price had increased every year. In the 5 years before Buffett purchased his first shares, the price increased an average of 18% every year. The company's fortunes were so good that Buffett was unable to purchase any shares at distressed prices. Still, he charged ahead. Price, he reminds us, has nothing to do with value. In June 1988, the price of Coca-Cola was approximately $10 per share, split adjusted. Over the next 10 months, Buffett acquired 93,400,000 shares, at an average price of $10.96, 15 times earnings, 12 times cash flow, and 5 times book value. He was willing to do that because of Coke's extraordinary level of economic goodwill, and because he believed the company's intrinsic value was much higher. The stock market's value of Coca-Cola in 1988 and 1989, during Buffett's purchase period, averaged $15.1 billion. But Buffett was convinced its intrinsic value was higher, $20 billion, assuming 5% growth, $32 billion, assuming 10% growth, $38 billion, at 12% growth, perhaps even $48 billion, if 15% growth. Therefore, Buffett's margin of safety, the discount to intrinsic value, could be as low as a conservative 27% or as high as 70%. At the same time, his conviction about the company had not changed. The probabilities of Coca-Cola's share price beating the market rate of return were going up, and up, see Figure 8.1. So what did Buffett do? Between 1988 and 1989, Berkshire Hathaway purchased more than $1 billion of Coca-Cola stock, representing 35% of Berkshire's common stock portfolio. It was a bold move. It was Buffett acting on one of his guiding principles: when the probabilities of success are very high, make a big bet. Gillette. From 1984 through 1990, the average annual gain in Gillette's share was 27%. In 1989, the share price gained 48%, and in 1990, the year before Berkshire converted its preferred stock to common, Gillette's share price rose 28%, see Figure 8.2. In February 1991, Gillette's share price reached $73 per share, pre-split, then a record high. At that time, the company had 97 million shares outstanding. When Berkshire converted, total shares increased to 109 million. Gillette's stock market value was $8.03 billion. Depending on your growth assumptions for Gillette, at the time of conversion the market price for the company was at a 50% discount to value, 15% growth in owner earnings, a 37% discount, 12% growth, or a 25% discount, 10% growth. The Washington Post company, even the most conservative calculation of value indicates that Buffett bought the Washington Post company for at least half of its intrinsic value. He maintains that he bought the company at less than 1/4 of its value. Either way, Buffett satisfied Ben Graham's premise that buying at a discount creates a margin of safety. The Pampered Chef. It is reported that Buffett bought a majority stake in the Pampered Chef for somewhere between $800,000 and $900,000. With pre-tax margins of 20 to 25%, this means that the Pampered Chef was bought at a multiple of 4.3 times to 5 times pre-tax income and 6.5 times to 7.5 times net income, assuming full taxable earnings. With revenue growth of 25% or above and net income that converts into cash at anywhere from a high fraction of earnings to a multiple of earnings, and with a very high return on capital, there is no doubt that the Pampered Chef was purchased at a significant discount. Clayton Homes. Berkshire's purchase of Clayton was not all smooth sailing. A legal battle erupted over the selling price. At $12.50 per share, Buffett's April 2003 offer for Clayton was at the low end of the $11.49 to $15.58 range that bankers had assigned to the shares a month earlier. Clayton management argued that the deal was fair considering the industry slump at the time. But Clayton shareholders mounted a battle in the courts, saying that Berkshire's offer was far below the real value of Clayton's shares. James J. Dorr, general counsel for Orbis Investment Management Limited, which voted its 5.4% stake against the merger, grumbled, "The fact that it's Warren Buffett who wants to buy from you should tell you that you shouldn't sell. At least not at his price. 15 for a value investor, that is probably a very high compliment." Warren Buffett defended his offer. At the time of the shareholder vote, he wrote, "The mobile home business was in bad shape and companies such as Clayton, which needs at least $1 billion of financing each year and faces declining sales, would continue to have a hard time finding funds." Clayton's board apparently agreed. Then, as evidence of his commitment to Clayton, Buffett added that he had advanced the company $360 million of financing since his offer. 16 Buffett and Clayton management ended up winning the shareholder battle by a narrow margin. Putting it all together, Warren Buffett has said more than once that investing in stocks is really simple. Find great companies that are run by honest and competent people and are selling for less than they are intrinsically worth. No doubt many who have heard and read that remark over the years have thought to themselves, "Sure, simple if you're Warren Buffett. Not so simple for me." Both sentiments are true. Finding those great companies takes time and effort, and that is never easy. But the next step, determining their real value so you can decide whether the price is right, is a simple matter of plugging in the right variables. And that is where the investment tenets described in these chapters will serve you well. The business tenets will keep you focused on companies that are relatively predictable. If you stick to those with a consistent operating history and favorable prospects, producing basically the same products for the same markets, you will develop a sense of how they will do in the future. The same is true if you concentrate on businesses that you understand. If not, you won't be able to interpret the impact of new developments. The management tenets will keep you focused on companies that are well run. Excellent managers can make all the difference in a company's future success. Together, the business and management tenets will give a good sense of the company's future earnings potential. The financial tenets will reveal the numbers you need to make a determination of the company's real value. The value tenets will take you through the mathematics necessary to come up with a final answer, based on everything you have learned. Is this a good buy? The two value tenets are crucial. But don't worry too much if you are unable to address the other 10 fully. Don't let yourself become paralyzed by too much information. Do the best you can, get started, and keep moving forward. 9. Investing in fixed income securities. Warren Buffett is perhaps best known in the investment world for his decisions in common stocks, and he is famous for his buy and hold positions in companies such as Coca-Cola, American Express, The Washington Post, and Gillette. His activities are not, however, limited to stocks. He also buys short-term and long-term fixed-income securities, a category that includes cash, bonds, and preferred stocks. In fact, fixed-income investing is one of Buffett's regular outlets, provided, as always, that there are undervalued opportunities. He simply seeks out, at any given time, those investments that provide the highest after-tax return. In recent years, this has included forays into the debt market, including corporate and government bonds, convertible preferred stock, and even high-yielding junk bonds. When we look inside these fixed-income transactions, what we see looks familiar, for Buffett has displayed the same approach that he takes with investments in stocks. He looks for margin of safety, commitment, and low prices, bargains. He insists on strong and honest management, good allocation of capital, and a potential for profit. His decisions do not depend on hot trends or market timing factors but instead are savvy investments based on specific opportunities where Buffett believes there are undervalued assets or securities. This aspect of Buffett's investing style doesn't receive a great deal of attention in the financial press, but it is a critical part of the overall Berkshire portfolio. Fixed-income securities represented 20% of Berkshire's investment portfolio in 1992. Today, 14 years later, that percentage has grown to about 30%. The reason for adding these fixed-income investments is simple: they were the best value at the time. Because of the absolute growth of the Berkshire Hathaway portfolio and the changing investment environment, including a lack of publicly traded stocks that he finds attractive, Buffett has often turned to buying entire companies and to acquiring fixed-income securities. He wrote in his 2003 letter to shareholders that it was hard to find significantly undervalued stocks, a difficulty greatly accentuated by the mushrooming of the funds we must deploy. In that same 2003 letter, Buffett explained that Berkshire would continue the capital allocation practices it had used in the past. If stocks become cheaper than entire businesses, then we will buy them aggressively. If selected bonds become attractive, as they did in 2002, we will again load up on these securities. Under any market or economic conditions, we will be happy to buy businesses that meet our standards. And, for those that do, the bigger, the better. Our capital is underutilized now. It is a painful condition to be in, but not as painful as doing something stupid. I speak from experience. To some extent, fixed income investments will always be necessary for Berkshire Hathaway's portfolio because of Berkshire's concentration in insurance companies. To fulfill their obligation to policyholders, insurance companies must invest some of their assets in fixed income securities. Still, Berkshire holds a significantly smaller percentage of fixed-income securities in its insurance investment portfolio compared with other insurance companies. Generally speaking, Buffett has tended to avoid fixed-income investments, outside what was needed for the insurance portfolios, whenever he feared impending inflation, which would erode the future purchasing power of money and therefore the value of bonds. Even though interest rates in the late 1970s and early 1980s approximated the returns of most businesses, Buffett was not a net purchaser of long-term bonds. There always existed, in his mind, the possibility of runaway inflation. In that kind of environment, common stocks would have lost real value, but bonds outstanding would have suffered far greater losses. An insurance company heavily invested in bonds in a hyperinflationary environment has the potential to wipe out its portfolio. Even though thinking of Buffett and bonds in the same sentence may be a new idea for you, it will come as no surprise that he applies the same principles as he does in valuing a company or stocks. He is a principle-based investor who will put his money in a deal where he sees a potential for profit, and he makes sure that the risk is priced into the deal. Even in fixed income transactions, his business owner's perspective means that he pays close attention to the issuing company's management, values, and performance. This bond as a business approach to fixed income investing is highly unusual, but it has served Buffett well. Bonds. Washington Public Power Supply System. Back in 1983, Buffett decided to invest in some bonds of the Washington Public Power Supply System, WPPSS. The transaction is a clear example of Buffett's thinking in terms of the possible gains from buying the bonds compared with those if he bought the entire company. On July 25, 1983, WPPSS, pronounced, with macabre humor, whoops, announced that it was in default of $2.25 billion in municipal bonds used to finance the uncompleted construction of 2 nuclear reactors, known as Projects 4 and 5. The state ruled that the local power authorities were not obligated to pay WPPSS for power they had previously promised to buy but ultimately did not require. That decision led to the largest municipal bond default in U.S. history. The size of the default and the debacle that followed depressed the market for public power bonds for several years. Investors moved quickly to sell their utility bonds, forcing prices lower and current yields higher. The cloud over WPPSS Projects 4 and 5 cast a shadow over Projects 1, 2, and 3. But Buffett perceived significant differences between the terms and obligations of Projects 4 and 5 on the one hand and those of Projects 1, 2, and 3 on the other. The first 3 were operational utilities that were also direct obligations of Bonneville Power Administration, a government agency. However, the problems of Projects 4 and 5 were so severe that some were predicting they could weaken the credit position of Bonneville Power. Buffett evaluated the risks of owning municipal bonds of WPPSS Projects 1, 2, and 3. Certainly there was a risk that these bonds could default and a risk that the interest payments could be suspended for a prolonged period. Still another factor was the upside ceiling on what these bonds could ever be worth. Even though he could purchase these bonds at a discount to their par value, at the time of maturity they could only be worth 100 cents on the dollar. Shortly after Projects 4 and 5 defaulted, Standard & Poor's suspended its ratings on Projects 1, 2, and 3. The lowest coupon bonds of Projects 1, 2, and 3 sank to 40 cents on the dollar and produced a current yield of 15 to 17% tax-free. The highest coupon bonds fell to 80 cents on the dollar and generated a similar yield. Undismayed, from October 1983 through June the following year, Buffett aggressively purchased bonds issued by WPPSS for Projects 1, 2, and 3. By the end of June 1984, Berkshire Hathaway owned $139 million of WPPSS Project 1, 2, and 3 bonds, both low coupon and high coupon, with a face value of $205 million. With WPPSS, explains Buffett, Berkshire acquired a $139 million business that could expect to earn $22.7 million annually after tax, the cumulative value of WPPSS annual coupons, and would pay those earnings to Berkshire in cash. Buffett points out there were few businesses available for purchase during this time that were selling at a discount to book value and earning 16.3% after tax on unleveraged capital. Buffett figured that if he set out to purchase an unleveraged operating company earning $22.7 million after tax,